Right, so I guess that's our sign. It's a pleasure to be here today. As we've said several times before the recording has started, it's the Israeli Independence Day. And to celebrate this way with such a big group of people is absolutely fantastic. So for those of you who don't know me yet, so my name is Ruth Paz, and we're heading a project entitled Seeing Antisemitism Through Law here at the University in Gießen, with a great team of researchers, Anna Pingen, who has done a lot for making the event happen today, and Anne-Kathrin Steger, who is also here with her camera open. So yeah, just so you know, you guys cannot use your microphones up until the end of the talk, and then we'll turn it on because we've had some anti-Semitic Zoom bombarding happening in our talks. So that's for the setting of today's talk. I'm so happy to have Bruno Chaouat today with us talking about literary philosophical revisionism. We're very, we're very curious about where that would take us today, Bruno. Bruno and I met a year ago at a conference at the Van Leer Center on anti-Semitism last year. And we have read before, when was it? Like about a year and a half ago, my team and I, we've read your text on theorizing anti-Semitic laughter. And I remember vividly that after we read it, we said, oh, we should definitely get this guy to talk to us. So I'm so happy that this is happening. So just a little bit about the format. For those of you who don't know, our presenter gets about 15 to 20 minutes time to talk, and then our commentator gives a comment for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we open the floor for Q&A. So Professor Bruno Chaouat is a professor of French and Jewish studies at the University of Minnesota. He received his PhD in French literature from Emory University, and since 2002, he has been teaching in the Department of French and Italian Studies, as well as at the Center of Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota. He has been the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, and chair of the Department of French and Italian. He's also an honorary fellow at the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society, and Politics at Durham University in the UK, and he focuses his research on testimony and Holocaust studies. More recently, he's published a book on the French responses to a resurgence of anti-Semitism and the relationship between postmodern thought and those responses. In theory, is very good for the Jews, just came out in 2016. And our commentator today is Professor Alejandro Baer, who is also from the University of Minnesota. So both have woken up early enough to join us. He has received his habilitation in sociology at the University of Bayreuth in 2013, and his PhD in sociology from Madrid in 2003. He's interested in the sociopolitical consequences of memory narratives and the delicate relationship between processes of collective remembering, reconciliatory initiatives, and the demand of justice in post-conflict and post-authoritarian societies. Without much ado, I will give the floor to Bruno now, and Alejandro will just follow his talk. And again, I wish us all a very insightful time today, and happy birthday to Israel.
Thank you so much, Reut. Thank you, Anna. Okay, I thought I had 25 to 30 minutes, so I will see how it works.
We'll live with that. We're very generous today.
That's very good. Okay, so I use the word revisionism loosely rather than in its technical and narrow sense with regard to the history of the Holocaust, and often used with scare quotes to distinguish it from genuine research. Revisionism is synonymous with denial. In the following paper, by revisionism, I mean a rhetoric and a logic that modify the historical event of the Holocaust to the point of relativization, distortion, or erasure. There are different strategies, malevolent or careless, intentional or structural, to that effect. I am going to focus on France, but I will indulge in digressions out of the French intellectual and literary context. The law in France regarding Holocaust and genocide denial is somewhat clear. Denying crimes against humanity is considered a punishable offense. On this forum, you are well aware of the Loi Mémorielle, and prior to those of the 1990 Gießen law. Speech that incites hatred towards certain groups is illegal in France, and Holocaust denial is deemed an expression of anti-Semitic hatred. More recently, other expressions of historical revisionism were added to the French legislation, signally contesting officially recognized crimes against humanity. I would be embarrassed to lecture a group of legal scholars on the technicalities of those laws. Suffice it to say that they give rise to vexed questions of hermeneutic and even of literary interpretation. Those laws also open a can of worms for professional historians who have protested against the risk of criminalization of historical research. This results in intractable problems with regard to free speech, the linguistic distinction between use and mention. Is the author embracing the term or opinion as his own, or is he merely citing it? And the ability to recover the author's original intent. In the case of fiction, a lawyer or a judge would need to sort out who speaks, narrator, character, or author. Narratology and more broadly literary theory, think of Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, or Derrida in general, have cast doubt on the possibility of distinctly identifying the voice and the intent of an author. This is perhaps why the US prides itself on the First Amendment to its Constitution, because the question of meaning is at once incontrovertible and, like Freud's analysis, interminable. The US prefers, in theory at least, though there has been some backtracking, to allow hate speech and denial of crimes against humanity, rather than turning judges into literary critics or psychoanalysts. This is arguably a legitimate, even a reasonable position. And the question of intent and authorship is not limited to literature. Think of the stand-up comedian Dieudonné. One can argue that on stage, he's a character, a persona, rather than himself. Who is the anti-Semite and Holocaust denier, the citizen author or the persona on the stage? I propose to present some cases that, while not qualifying as Holocaust denial, nonetheless promote distortion, inversion, perversion, or relativization. We find an egregious case of inversion or perversion of the history of the Holocaust in the post-war Louis Ferdinand Céline. Céline is part of a matrix of literary post-war historical perversion among former collaborators and anti-Semites. This matrix is not limited to post-Vichy or far-right sympathizers. We find Holocaust deniers in the radical left as of the 1960s, as has been shown by Israeli philosopher Hanan Yakira. The celebrated author of the 1932 novel Journey to the End of the Night, Céline collaborated with the Nazi regime, wrote violent anti-Semitic pamphlets during the war, and after his detention for collaboration, pursued his literary production. His post-war books are mainly autobiographical, but they also belong to the genre of what he called féerie, i.e. fantastical literature. But one insistent theme, to be sure not the only one, of his post-war fiction is self-exoneration and self-victimization. Céline portrays himself as the target of a conspiracy. In his writings, the Allies are worse than the Germans, no one has understood his pamphlets, and the whole world wants him dead. Céline claims to be the scapegoat of post-war France, and of course, it is not hard to imagine whom he implies as wishing to purge France of its collaborators and of himself. Literary scholar Philippe Watts had aptly talked using the poet Mallarmé's phrase of Céline, demon of analogy. And indeed, analogy gone awry is a large part of the revisionist narrative, especially the equivalence between victim and perpetrator, between concentration camp survivors and collaborators in hiding during the purge targeting them. In his allegories of the purge, Philippe Watts writes, I quote, revisionist discourse, whatever form it takes, is characterized by a regression from analogy to denial, end quote. We also find this demon of analogy at around the same time in a very different genre in the few lines that Heidegger ever dedicated to the death camps and the gas chambers. Those few sentences have been glossed numerous times by multiple scholars. It is still worth refreshing our memory. In his 1949 Bremen lecture on Gestell, Heidegger wrote, I quote, agriculture is now a motorized food industry, as to its essence the same as the manufacturing of corpses in gas chambers and extermination camps, the same as the blockading and starving of nations, the same as the manufacture of hydrogen bombs, end quote. In those three lines, Heidegger compares motorized agriculture, the Allies' war crimes, and blockades with the gas chambers. Dresden or Hiroshima are analogous to the death camps, a trope that we find up until today in contemporary French novels. Can go back to it if you'd like later. Returning to Heidegger, the most troubling aspect of his gas chamber equivalence is the way in which he harnesses what I consider a legitimate critique of technique, what he calls Gestell, to a revisionist narrative. Here we are witnessing how philosophy, or rather thought, as Heidegger would call his practice, can be used to revise history. The critique of Gestell, the idea that being is entirely subsumed to calculation and instrumental rationality, and that the earth has turned into a giant resource to be mined by man, leads Heidegger to erase the difference between the disasters of technoscience and engineering, and they are many and worth denouncing, and the specific nature of the extermination of the Jews, most strikingly, the political intent of extermination. I usually tell my students that many other thinkers have denounced technoscience, Gunther Anders, Adorno and Horkheimer, Jacques Ellul, Hans Jonas, for example, and that we don't need to turn to Heidegger for a philosophical argument on environmental ethics. But leaving the Heidegger debate aside, whether his paragraph on the death camps is purely strategic, whether it constitutes a covert exoneration of the Nazi crime and of himself, it is clear that Heidegger erased the specificity of Nazi anti-Semitism. It is as though for the thinker of being, the West, since Aristotelian philosophy, was on a fateful path toward Gestell, as though the gas chambers were one more station on this path, an incident in the long history of Western decline. Heidegger can thus move from continuum equivalencies to inversion, relativization, and erasure. Note that he does not deny the existence of the gas chambers, but he inscribes them in the history of the so-called forgetfulness of being. As Jean-François Lyotard had put it in his sharp critique, Heidegger does not make or pretends not to make any distinction between Auschwitz and a bean factory. Note also that the rhetoric of inversion, as semanticist François Rastier has noted, the Nazis did not manufacture corpses. Auschwitz did not produce death, but destroyed life. We often encounter such indifference to historical specificity in thinkers who at times genuinely subscribe to this continuum narrative. The topographical materiality of the camps, the different origins and reasons for detention, for example, those are of no interest to those thinkers insofar as it troubles their smooth theory. Historians share with legal scholars the attention to singularity. To put it more bluntly, history is often an obstacle to theory, and vice versa. Theory can undermine historical research. Furthermore, I would argue that the continuum narrative tends to resort to a rhetoric of pathos. Think of Heidegger's other reference to the death camps. There are apparently two in his corpus, and the repetition of the rhetorical question, sterben Sie, that implies that modern death is not authentic death, and more specifically that those who have died en masse and anonymously in death camps did not authentically experience their death, and thus are not worthy of the name mortal, i.e. human Dasein. And I quote Heidegger, der Mensch ist noch nicht der Sterbliche. Consider now, closer to us in time, another case of continuum narrative and use of pathos. The Swedish writer Sven Lindqvist's 1996 book, Exterminate All the Brutes. The book, you may recall, embarked the reader on a macabre journey into the history of Western crimes from colonialism to the Holocaust. For linguists, all of those crimes are grounded on racial theory and the alleged superiority of the white race. Not unlike Giorgio Agamben, on whom more anon, the author uses ellipses and a rhapsodic style to persuade the reader that racist crimes lie in the DNA of European modernity. To justify his title and the reference to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, linguist distorts an obscure etymology of the word Europe, which he claims comes from a Semitic word that means darkness. In reality, the origin of the word Europe is itself obscure. One hypothesis ties it to the setting of the sun, i.e. Occident or the West. To my knowledge, there is no moral connotation. The linguist book is a lengthy moral indictment of Europe, a civilization whose alleged mission is the extermination of its other, the uncivilized. For the writer, the very name Europe determines a dark destiny. According to such pathos, dehumanization of the other, the colonized, the so-called brute, culminates in the Holocaust. Here, to be fair, the continuum narrative does not rest on an idiosyncratic speculation on the history of being, or a lament about the corruption of the Western Schicksal, but on the actual history of modern European domination. Nonetheless, in order to establish this historical continuum, linguists need to subsume the complex history of modern Europe and reduce it to a long, coherent trajectory from colonial expansion to genocide. Here's a line from the book, I quote, "Auschwitz was the modern industrial application of a policy of extermination on which European world domination had long since rested," end quote. This sentence, written in the form of an aphorism or fragment, it stands as an isolated paragraph on the page, simplifies the complex centuries of modern Europe. Linguist appears indifferent to the debates regarding the Enlightenment, as well as to philosophers who have argued that Nazism breaks with Western spirituality and philosophy, including with Marxism, liberalism, and the Enlightenment. I am thinking of Levinas' pre-war essay Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism. For linguists, European episteme is the culprit, and not unlike Edward Said's indictment of Orientalism as imperialism, libido sciendi, European thirst for knowledge, leads to extermination. The continuum narrative is even more questionable when wrapped in such rhetorical pathos. This is why I am less troubled by Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust. Bauman makes a rational argument, than by linguist dark rhapsody. Linguists' use of fragment and aphorism, his quasi-poetic writing, tend to numb the reader's critical sense. For him, there is a continuum between Lebensraum and Todesraum, between colonial and imperial expansion and extermination. European imperialism had to use, according to him, racial hierarchy to justify its expansion. To be sure, Lebensraum has led to genocide, but again, this does not account for murdering of the Jews, who were not an obstacle to the Reich expansion. More recently, the continuum narrative can be read in the critique of what is polemically called neoliberalism. This is best shown in the 2007 film adaptation of François Emmanuel's novella, La Question Humaine, translated as Heartbeat Detector. Again, the same rhetoric of pathos is at work. In the movie, it's particularly obvious. Everything from soundtrack to the detective plot, the enigmatic characters contribute to persuade the spectator into believing that there is a continuum between the final solution and contemporary corporate culture. In Libre d'obéir, le management du nazisme aujourd'hui, historian Jacques Chapoutot argues that we have inherited some of the managerial methods of Nazi corporate politics. Like Nazi management, based on empowerment of employees, modern corporations are characterized by collaboration, freedom, creativity, and personal development. And the Nazi Reinhard Höhn, who had done so much to develop modern management during the Third Reich, will, after the war, promote the new ideal of economic growth and contribute to the German miracle. The movie La Question Humaine purports to show the dark origins of modern management, but identifying, as Chapoutot has done, some trends in managerial techniques common to the Third Reich and to our corporate culture does not imply that contemporary management in liberal democracies is Nazi and even less anti-Semitic. So the film presents us with two possible readings. A, anti-Semitism and racism do not constitute the kernel of Nazism. Nazism is equated with neoliberal dehumanization. And B, modern management is anti-Semitic and racist. Only a shallow reading of Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil elicits such inferences, some of which Alvin Rosenfeld has debunked in The End of the Holocaust. And yet, François Emmanuel's novella and its film adaptation present a large contemporary corporation managed by the son of a Nazi. As a result, white-collar employees are treated as a mere material to be disposed of. The Jewish question becomes the human question, or even the human resources question. Either the Holocaust is used as a metaphor for neoliberalism, or the film suggests a continuum between Nazi dehumanization and corporate reduction of human beings to disposable material. The conflation between corporate cynicism and the Nazi politics of extermination nurtures conspiracy theories and the idea that neoliberalism intentionally tries to eliminate human beings deemed unfit. What the continuum narrative misses is, if not the so-called uniqueness of the Holocaust, a notion that I don't find particularly helpful, at least the distinction between biopolitics and thanatopolitics, between the administration of life and the administration of death on a large scale, i.e. the politics of extermination. The whole question is whether biopolitics and thanatopolitics are two sides of the same coin, or whether they are two different coins. Are societies of control, discipline, and surveillance thanatopolitical? Is administered life the first step toward the administration of death on a large scale? While the Nazis obviously used biopolitical apparatuses, I would argue that those apparatuses do not inevitably result in mass extermination. Biopolitical apparatuses may be a means towards several different ends, of which genocide is an extreme one. But one needs to have a particular ideology, a superstructure as it were, the Führerprinzip, for example, and yes, an intent based on the racial myth in the case of Nazism, to harness biopolitics and population management to extermination. Neoliberal surveillance and control, the administration of life in postmodern societies, are bad enough. We don't need the Holocaust analogy to denounce them. The influence of Michel Foucault is palpable here. What is troubling is not so much that those narratives point to a continuity between the administration of life, biopolitics, and the concentration camp, but between biopolitical techniques developed in modernity and the Entlosung. What I mean is that the concentration camp seems indeed to have been the result of at least 1 century of biopolitics. But the Holocaust, and I know that this is a controversial view, disrupts the continuum between biopolitics and the universe of the camps. At this juncture, let me turn to Foucault's very rare intervention, some even call it his screaming silence, about the Holocaust. Alan Milkman and Alan Rosenberg have argued that not only Foucault was haunted by the history of Nazism, but that Auschwitz cannot be understood without his theory of biopolitics. That Foucault's theory sheds light on the history of racism and the correlation between modernity and racial theory is undeniable. In fact, Foucault's archaeological method, his genealogy of the science de l'homme, in part based on Georges Canguilhem's epistemology of normalcy and pathology, normal and abnormal, constitutes a formidable tool for reading our modernity, or at least the darkest aspects of our modernity. It is obvious that biopolitics, la gestion de la vie, has furthered the development of apparatuses of inclusion and exclusion and statistical population control. Modern biopolitics has drawn clear lines between the normal and the abnormal, the healthy and the insane, etc. But is biopolitics a sufficient condition for Nazism and the Holocaust? Foucault, I quote, pointed out that with the reign of biopolitics, the simultaneous possibility of protecting life and of the Holocaust make their historical appearance, end quote. That allowing to live and letting die constitute the two poles of the dialectic of modern sovereignty is certainly a powerful theory. Indeed, establishing what a life worthy of being lived implies, as a counterpart, deciding which lives are not worth living. Furthermore, Foucault's reflection on the carceral world illuminates the logic of the concentration camp. Literary theorist Maurice Blanchot, an admirer of Foucault, praised his insight, albeit with a significant addition, namely that the target of Nazism was not merely the impure races, but, and I quote Blanchot, the indestructible heritage of the people of the Bible, end quote. On the other hand, Foucault states, speaking of the Third Reich, and I quote Foucault now, one has an absolutely racist state, an absolutely murderous state, and an absolutely suicidal state. These are necessarily superimposed and lead at the same time to the final solution through which the attempt was made to eliminate through the Jews all other races for whom the Jews were the symbol and manifestation, decided on in 1942-1943, and then to Telegram 71 in April 45, through which Hitler gave the order to destroy the basis of life for the German people itself, end quote. Foucault here traces the continuity between the final solution and Hitler's order to cripple German economy and infrastructures once the defeat became inevitable. Hitler's scorched earth policy for Foucault would make the Holocaust into just one moment in the history of thanatopolitics as the corollary or perhaps as the necessary turning point of any biopolitics. It would be absurd to read Foucault as a revisionist, certainly in the technical sense of the word, but I would argue that his continuum narrative, modernity leads to biopolitics, leads to genocide, leads to the final solution, and to the suicide of Germany, omits the specificity of the target, as Blanchot puts it, the indestructible heritage of the people of the Bible. The metaphysical and hyperphysical target, the people of the Bible, must be somehow forgotten or avoided as such to promote the continuum narrative. Hence Foucault's sentence, I quote, through which the attempt was made to eliminate through the Jews all other races for whom the Jews were the symbol and manifestation, begs the question, why were the Jews symbol and manifestation of all other so-called inferior races? I do not see the slightest answer to this question in continuum narratives. Continuum narratives tend to put aside or minimize the anti-Semitic core of Nazism, the metaphysics of anti-Semitism. They tend to think about evil as a natural consequence of biopolitics, from prison to modern clinical gaze to the camp. They can only shed light on one aspect of Nazism and Holocaust, namely the concentration camp, but they cannot tell the whole story, provided that such explanation can even be envisioned. To be sure, one can argue that once the Jews were construed as the enemy race based on pseudoscience, the administration of life, biopolitics, had to decide who lives and who dies, and that some lives are not worth living, or that some lives endanger the life of the folk. And yet the question remains, why Jewish lives? And this is that very same question that in the wake of Foucault, Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben conveniently circumvents. In his 1999 book, Remnants of Auschwitz, there is not much, if anything at all, on anti-Semitism. There is a lot on the phenomenology of shame, Heidegger and Levinas, Foucault and biopolitics, Lacan's mirror stage, Révei's structural linguistics, Carl Schmitt and Walter Benjamin, testimony theory, and so many other exciting theories, but not much indeed on the Jews or the gas chambers. This omission has been noticed a long time ago by Philippe Ménard and Claudine Cahan, and much more recently by French political philosopher Géraldine Mühlmann. Again, construing Agamben as a Holocaust denialist would be disingenuous, if not even slanderous. But the distortion is nonetheless palpable. The case of Agamben is representative of a philosophical movement of return to what Mühlmann calls polemically the theologico-political fraud throughout the past 30 years. Mühlmann dedicates a chapter of her exploration of the return of the theologico-political paradigm to Agamben. Carl Schmitt famously claimed that all political concepts were a mere secularization of theological ones, and that modern politics remained a theology in disguise. Mühlmann argues that the past 30 years have seen a return to the Schmittian claim, i.e. the theologico-political. This return bears witness to an old longing for history as solution, i.e. as an attempt at smoothing the contingencies of the real and at polishing the asperities of facts to foster a new philosophy of history. For Agamben, the Holocaust is inscribed in a narrative of redemption through catastrophe. We call it secular messianism or apocalypticism. The figure of extreme suffering in the camp known as the Musulman is elevated to a figure of redemption. Drawing on Philippe Ménard and Claudine Kahn's rigorous critique of Agamben's indifference to historical facts, Mühlmann reminds us that after 41, Jews were murdered long before reaching the condition of Musulmaner. Mühlmann goes as far as to call Agamben's playing fast and loose with facts a kind of chic revisionism. Agamben needs the figure of the Musulman to promote his religious idea of a messianic horizon. In other words, Agamben revises Foucault's biopolitics through the prism of his theological political paradigm, rooted in a messianic philosophy of history. To build his messianic paradigm, Agamben borrows from the Apostle Paul, on whom he dedicated a book entitled The Time That Remains. A very strange development appears in the middle of the book on Paul, Carl Schmitt, and the state of exception. The pathos of esotericism in Agamben's style makes it hard to interpret those pages. Let me make an attempt. For Agamben, influenced by Jacob Taubes, Paul is the original figure of the suspension of the law, the state of exception. The suspension of the law, the exception, is a necessary step toward redemption, the end of history. And Agamben, who loves nothing more than drawing analogies that lure the reader into adhering to his continuum narrative, bridges Paul's call to suspend the law to the Nazi camp where all law was suspended. He accomplishes this tour de force through Schmitt, who, as we know, was the Nazi legal scholar who theorized the concept of the political in terms of the exception. The sovereign is endowed with the right to suspend all rights. He is the one who decides between friend and enemy. In sum, Schmitt broke with the liberal state and invented a totalitarian state that would soon enough translate his theory into racial agonism. Several years after Schmitt's theorizing the exception, people will be detained in camps which, for Agamben, exemplifies the exception, the site where all rights are suspended. There in the camp, humans can be killed in total lawlessness. The Musulman is the figure who embodies the horror of the suspension of the law and the ultimate redemption. In other words, the camp is a necessary condition for universal redemption. From Paul's eschatological call to suspend the law to Hitler concentration camps, we have a spectacular illustration of the trouble with this new philosophy of history, with this recycling of theological concepts into a critique of biopolitics. I will end here and hear with great interest, of course, my friend Alejandro's comments. Thank you very much.
Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Bruno, for your thought-provoking lecture. I'm in Madrid, actually. I didn't wake up early. I'm the entire year in Madrid, and let me get in my text. I would like to start with just discussing Bruno's definition of revisionism, this rather loose definition as he defined it, a rhetoric that modifies the historical event of the Holocaust to the point of relativization, distortion, or erasure. And of course, these three terms involve many different phenomena and practices, if we define revisionism with these terms. And even if most of the cases offered by Bruno are problematic because they are equation between victims and perpetrators or gross distortion that offer little doubt that there is revisionism, even as a form of denial or as a soft denial, as Yehuda Baer has put it often, there is still a significant gray zone in the understanding of revisionism, the way revisionism is used, often also as a rhetorical tool. And I would say that there needs to be a sort of a case-by-case approach or a model of analysis that takes into consideration, as you have also pointed out, intentions, the authors or the actors that are making the claim, who are the authors making the claim that could be labeled as revisionist, and then the reception and perception and the reaction to those claims. I would also add another category here, another way of looking at this, to look at the social life of certain claims, right? The appropriations, the uses, the misuses of theories and analogies. Often the claims in themselves are not anti-Semitic, but somehow are paving the way to anti-Semitism, or at least to arguments that can have anti-Semitic undertones. So what is Holocaust distortion and relativization? And many of you might know that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has produced guidelines for recognizing and countering Holocaust distortion, with recommendations for policy and decision makers. Which I looked at, and they define Holocaust distortion in the following terms: the use of the term Holocaust to reference events or concepts that are not related in any meaningful way to the genocide of European Jews and of European and North African Jewry by the Nazi Germany and its accomplices between 1941 and 1945. However, it still leaves us it doesn't really help much, right? In any meaningful way. What is a meaningful way? When are these comparisons and analogies, these uses of the Holocaust appropriate? And let me give an example that is a little bit a detour. I'll come back to Bruno's talk in a second. But in the summer of 2019, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat of New York, sparked uproar for discussing the detention camps along the southern US border as concentration camps, and using the term never again. This drew sharp criticism, and after several days of heated media and political debate, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum released the following statement: the museum unequivocally rejects efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. A few weeks later, more than 300 Holocaust scholars signed an open letter urging the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to retract its statement. And the argument of the letter was that the museum's decision is ahistorical, it is far removed from mainstream scholarship on the Holocaust and genocide, and it makes learning from the past almost impossible. Also, they pointed out that it was confusing that the USHMM itself had actually generated and distributed statements that made analogies with the Holocaust. So what was exactly being analogized in the Ocasio-Cortez case? Well, strictly speaking, concentration camp is a place of mass detention, a place for mass detention of civilians without trial, not an extermination facility. For the critics, the words concentration camps have meant and have always meant the Holocaust, industrialized slaughter and genocide. And Ocasio-Cortez has used the Holocaust to sensationalize an immigration crisis, making blasphemous, even anti-Semitic comparison, which the words relativization and ultimately erasure was also used because it somehow degrades the understanding of the implications and the significance of the Holocaust. Now, is that the case? Here we must ask who invokes the Holocaust and with what purpose. So we go back to the question of the author, of the actor making the claim. And a helpful tool is the notion of a bridging metaphor introduced by sociologist Jeffrey Alexander. He understands that concepts, symbols, and images of the Holocaust are taken out of their immediate context and are employed to code in a single term the collective pain that people inflict upon others. So it has powerful resonances. Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans, labeled the Whitney plantation as America's Auschwitz. Just last week in Puerto Llano in southern Spain, I heard how a victim of Francoism said, why do we know about the Holocaust, but not about the brutal repression of the Franco regime? Representatives of minority groups themselves have begun to represent their own traumatic experiences by creating parallels with the Holocaust. I heard a couple of years ago a Dakota elder in Minnesota saying Alexander Ramsey, who was the first governor of Minnesota, Ramsey was our Hitler. So bridging and comparing across genocides, we're looking here at a complex discursive field. It has scholarly and political promises, but of course also the challenges and risks. And I will come back to the risks in a second. Bruno engages with the question of uniqueness and specificity and the perils of analogical generalization. And given Bruno's field, literary studies, I thought of, when preparing for this response, of the Philip Roth passage, which you, Bruno, introduced me to. I know it thanks to your suggestion. No? It's from I Married a Communist, from that novel. The great generalizer is politics, and literature, the great particularizer. And not only are they in an inverse relationship to each other, they are in an antagonistic relationship. So I would ask you to maybe to think of that antagonistic relationship from your field, the literary studies, and maybe you can hear a little bit more how literature specifically engages with that specificity. Now, what happens with history, with the field of history? Historians engage in case study research and in comparison across cases. Of course, comparison has a risk of eliding differences, but uniqueness and likeness can only be demonstrated through comparison. So in that sense, analogy is a heuristic tool. Bruno, in your paper, you write, historians share with legal scholars the attention to singularity. Now, is that the case? It's also a question for our audience. I understand that there are legal scholars among them. But in my understanding, addressing a legal case is subsuming specifics of a case under general, broad, more abstract categories, for instance, genocide. And this brings me to my last point, well, actually, your central point, the continuum narrative, and the question, when does analogy lead to denial, even if it's that sort of soft denial? And I wanted to bring up also, might be interesting for the discussion, to discuss the so-called Historikerstreit 2.0, the debate sparked by genocide scholars who situate and interpret the Holocaust within a global history of colonial violence, which has many resonances with the cases that you have presented in your paper. But first, let us look briefly, and the German audience knows this by heart, but still there might be some who do not among the audience, to mention the first Historikerstreit. There, Germany was simply a link in a chain of according to these conservative historians, and Nolte among them, Germany was simply a link in a chain of exterminatory politics of long standing. You know? Nolte famously argued that Auschwitz was the fear-born reaction to the acts of annihilation that took place during the Russian Revolution. From the liberal camp, Habermas heading that camp, these conservative historians were relativizing the Holocaust, no? By linking it to Bolshevik crimes and rendering it harmless. No? Verharmlosung, which is a word, harmlessing, or rendering it harmless, that we hear very often in debates around anti-Semitism in Germany and nowadays too. The present dispute, second 2.0 Historikerstreit, protagonized by scholars such as Michael Rothberg or Dick Moses, here the historical continuum is the following: the Holocaust must be understood as a colonial genocide. What Germans did in Eastern Europe is the same as what Westerners, including Germany, did elsewhere before. And moreover, there are essential aspects they claim of the National Socialist regime and the Holocaust that can only be understood through its relation to colonial imperialism. The resulting political reading is that Europeans tolerated, legitimized, supported this sort of proto-Nazism before it was directed against them. The critique that follows, or that is part of this dispute, comes from mostly Holocaust historians that have criticized that this perspective does not do justice to the singular significance of the genocide of European Jews. As in Bruno's terms, it's also the anti-Semitic core of Nazism, of anti-Semitism as a distinct form of hatred. It omits the specificity of the target, as you write in your paper, Jews exterminated in the gas chambers. So the accusation is that this is revisionist, and also anti-Semitic. But we must look at this also structurally. It is the same as the first historical strike, but with a different political valence. Those accused of diminishment, dilution, and relativization are not scholars with a nationalist, apologist agenda. It was a critique in the first historical strike. Here, these scholars come from a progressive camp and claim that an overemphasis on the Holocaust, on the Shoah, is depriving other histories of visibility both in scholarship, but more importantly, in German memorial culture. And of course, this is when the claims becomes problematic, and the readings of this claim, of this argument, can often have anti-Semitic undertones. What is at stake, and take a couple more minutes, if that's okay, are the political ramifications of scholarly arguments, or the weaponization of theory in the current cultural wars. And in relation to post-colonial theory's role in these heated debates, my colleague Nathan Schneider employed, I think, quite fruitfully, the metaphors of the plowshare and the sword, metaphors that were introduced by Max Weber to raise the difference between practical political and scientific analysis. The words are not plowshares, in Weber's words, to break up the soil of contemplative thought, but swords to use against the adversary. They are weapons in the struggle. But certainly arguments for Holocaust, for the uniqueness of the Holocaust, which Bruno sees also as not very helpful, can also be swords, weapons, and we see this playing out in the German debate. I'd like to leave it here, and just with these brief inputs to spark discussion and debate with Bruno and with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very insightful talk, and then obviously comment. I have so much to ask, but how we do it now is that Bruno gets the stage to reply to Alejandro, and then we open, and then Alejandro can respond to Bruno, and then we open it to the floor. I just wanted to say that your comment that historians, I mean, both your comments are that historians and lawyers often deal with or pay attention to legal singularity, and that goes back to our research that is comparative, right? Because so in common law system, singularity is one thing, whereas in civil law systems, it's a different thing. So it's also bringing us back to the idea of comparative. And Bruno, it makes complete sense that that's how you've spotted it, whereas Alejandro, who's now in Spain, makes sense that this is the comment that you made on Bruno's talk. But Bruno, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Alejandro. As always, it's such a productive conversation between you and me for so many years. And I miss you a lot, by the way. But I want to, I liked a lot what you said at the end, because it has to do with the problem I have with the agonistic rhetoric, if you will. And I think it's very, very important, first of all, not to stigmatize analogists, people who make analogies and say that they are anti-Semitic. It's not the case always, far from it. I don't see Ocasio-Cortez as an anti-Semite. I see her, however, as a strategist. And I think the problem that we have now on campuses and beyond campuses is that there is a sort of confusion between the strategic rhetoric, i.e. a rhetoric that is meant to gain something politically, call it power, right? And a rhetoric of the search for truth. I'm not saying that there is such a thing as truth, but there is such a thing as an ethics of search for truth. And my job as an academic is to abide by this ethics of search for truth. And in that sense, I am very critical of the strategic use of the analogy or this revisionism going back to the debate in the 1980s up to now, as you said, from right-wing revisionism to a sort of global left type of analogizing, or let's say continuum. I think I kind of like this idea of the continuum narrative. I don't know if it's relevant, but I think it's useful for me right now. And I think that in both cases, what is at stake is efficacy and performing something in the realm of political power. I'm not sure that it's possible to escape the entanglement between power and knowledge. We've all read Foucault, but at least as a sort of horizon, as a sort of regulatory idea, I think it's important to keep those separated at some point. And that's the reason why I am so critical of Michael Rothberg and others who are, making this, continuum, and Sven Lindqvist, who is making continuum narrative. I think it pertains to a rhetoric of pathos rather than a rhetoric of search for intellectual inquiry. So these would be kind of like a comment on your comment. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, yes, Philip Roth, and Philip Roth has this line in Married a Communist, says generalized suffering, I think if I remember, generalized suffering here is communism, particularized suffering here is literature. And it is true that as a literary scholar, I try as much as possible to pay attention to not the uniqueness, but to the singularity. Again, I'm not a historian, so I'm aware that there is a whole debate in historiography today about colonialism, Holocaust, all that. I've read like all of us, but I pay attention to the singularity, and that's the reason why I was mentioning Maurice Blanchot, who is an extraordinary literary critic with his own limitations, like all of us, but brilliant literary critic and novelist in his own right. And Maurice Blanchot, who had some very contentious and controversial positions before the war, by the way, in terms of the Jews and communism and so on, nonetheless has understood that the target was the Jews. And so he understood that the Holocaust had something to do with a history of religion, of metaphysics, and this is the main limitation of the continuum narrative, is that it usually brackets, circumvents, avoids, foreclose, as Lacan would say, this precludes, whatever, this very specificity of the target, and as you said, the core of Nazi ideology, which is anti-Semitism. And again, I will repeat, why would the Jews stand for the manifestation and symbol of all the other races deemed inferior? I still don't have an answer to that, unless we get into the history of theology and metaphysics, where there we can find an answer. That is, in other words, unless we go into the very DNA of the West and its extremely difficult positionality vis-a-vis the Jews since the very beginning of Christianity. Okay, I'm done with the response here.
Thank you so much. And so, Alejandro, you have a comment on the comment. And I just wanted to say, so if we take Roth seriously with the general suffering and the particular suffering, so the Jew is both a communist and a literary critic. So, I mean, anyway, go ahead, Alejandro.
No, I was going to suggest to open the floor, and maybe we can then, we can hear from the audience, and then we can continue. I can continue debating.